Our second speaker this afternoon will be Aren Maeir, who is Associate Professor at the Martin Stroes Department of the Land of Israel Studies and Archaeology at Bar-Ilan University, and co-director of the joint Bar-Ilan and Weizmann Institute of Science program in archaeological science, and he now directs the Tel el-Safi Gath archaeological project. His research interests are the second and first millennium Levant, with a particular focus on the Philistines. During the second half of the 9th century, Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, was the dominant political figure in the southern Levant. Among the various military campaigns he conducted, the one to the southern coastal plain is barely known. In fact, it's only known from the biblical text in 2 Kings. Recent archaeological finds, in particular those from the excavations of Professor Maeir at Tel el-Safi, and the relation to the extent and nature of Hazael's campaign are the subject of his presentation this afternoon.
Good afternoon. You'll wait a second while I start the presentation. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon, I'm going to speak about, as Professor Kogan said, about Hazael's campaign and the evidence, particularly from the excavations that we've been conducting at Tel el-Safi Gath. And in fact, we're just finished the last season, the 2009 season, at last Thursday. But before we deal with the campaign, we'll start with a description of the relevant finds from the site. Tel el-Safi is a large site, one of the largest pre-Hellenistic sites in the land of Israel, which is situated on the border between the coastal plain and the Shfela, the Judean foothills, more or less halfway between Jerusalem and Ashkelon, and it's well known as one of the 5 Pentapolis cities of the so-called Philistine Pentapolis. And as we will see, during the 9th and 10th centuries, the Iron Age 2A, it apparently is also the largest of these 5 cities. Now, the site of Tel el-Safi has been, and its identity has been discussed for a very long period of time. If just will stopped. Well, anyway, I'll tell you what I can tell you without what's written. For many, many years, there was a very big discussion on what the identity of the site is, and now it started. Okay. Yep. Although for the identity of the site, as suggested in the beginning, was Gath in the mid-19th century, from the 1920s and onwards, when Albright made the suggestion that to locate the site at Tel Erani, that was the dominant opinion for many, many years. I would say possibly for no other reason except for the fact that he was a dominant personality. And though from the 70s and onwards, both from an analysis of the biblical and extra-biblical texts, first by Rainey and then by Schniedewen, and then based on the finds from our excavation, it now seems quite sure that the identity of the site is in fact as Gath of the Philistines. And although, as I always say, we haven't found the sign, "Welcome to Gath," you never know. Now, as you can see from the views of the site, it's a very large and dominating site, and during the period we're dealing with, it's close to 500 dunam. As I said, one of the largest sites in the land, and it can be seen from just about anywhere in the southwestern part of the Levant. If you drive anywhere from Tel Aviv to Gaza on the coast, and you know where to look, you can see it. If you drive anywhere from Ramallah down to Hebron, and you know where to look, you can see it as well. So it explains its role and its importance over many, many periods from the proto-historic through the modern times. Now, One of the problems with the excavation of the site is, of course, that it's covered over, for the most part, by the remains of a modern village that was abandoned in 1948 during the Israeli War of Independence. And here you can see a view of the site. I apologize for the poor quality. And by the way, maybe we shut the lights off. I'm not reading. Here we can see a view of the Tel in the 1920s. And aside from a very brief excavation in 1899 by Lisa McAllister, basically until the site was excavated by the current team, very little was known about the site. Now, the main problem, as I said, is the modern remains there. And although the Ottoman and the medieval period are very interesting periods, it's not the period that interests me. And one of the main issues that has been keeping us busy over the last decade and a half is to find areas on the site where we can excavate and reach Bronze and Iron Age levels. And basically, most of our excavation strategy has been aimed at finding those areas. And the areas that you see marked off with the blue squares are our main areas of excavations on various parts of the Tel, starting from the upper Tel over here, and more recently in the lower city as well, which I will detail further on. Now here you can see the major features, I'll skip that, and the major areas of excavation, looking from the north to the main area, Area A, which I'll be discussing in a moment, and looking from the east to west, Area E and A, the modern village, and Area F near the top of the Tel. Again, the major areas of excavation on the eastern spur, Area A, which I will be dealing with extensively, Area E, Area P, on the summit, Area F, a burial zone to the southeast, the lower city, Area D, the siege system, which I will be discussing slightly further on in the lecture, and the excavation area C6, which relates to the siege system. And just a quick aerial view. And now, we're not going to be going through the entire stratigraphy, and as you can see, we cover a period of more or less from the early Bronze through to the modern period. What we'll be focusing on in this lecture is the Iron Age 2A, and in fact, the later part of the Iron Age 2A, the 9th century, the stratum in Area A, which was known as stratum A3, and we've found in almost every part of the site where we've excavated extensive remains of this layer. In excavations, a very, very impressive destruction level. Again, we'll expand on this in a moment. And wherever we surveyed, very, very dominant finds from this stage. And as you will see, we connect this level and its destruction with the conquest, with the siege and the conquest of Gath by Hazael of Aram Damascus. Now, most of the finds from this very impressive layer come from Area A on the eastern side of the cell, and here you can see an aerial photograph of this part of the excavation, and superimposed on it right now, this is more or less an up-to-date plan of the A3 late 9th century level, which was destroyed in the late 9th century. Yes. Now, wherever we excavated, we find these very impressive remains. And here you can see, I'm just going to zip through various finds, and you can see how they're very well preserved. Complete vessels, hundreds and hundreds of vessels, just about every type of object you can imagine, from every spectrum, every part of the spectrum of daily life, cultic vessels, and also, I would call, microscopic things. And one of the interesting things, which was mentioned already, I have the honor to co-direct the Bar-Ilan University Weizmann Institute of Science joint program in archaeological science, and through a wide spectrum of fields in archaeological science, we can study both the macro, but particularly the micro perspective on the finds from this and other strata. And for example, here's just a couple of perspectives that we get from in the field, whether it's through flotation, a very interesting object, which turns out was used for production of wine, and as you know, the Philistines liked wine. Or just recently, we excavated in the last couple of weeks a building from this destruction, and once we start going down, we can see collapsed roofing, and here you can see the negative imprints of the reeds that were used for the roofing, signs of burning, which through a spectroscopic analysis we can tell which parts of the houses were burnt and which were not, fallen bricks and how they fell, objects in situ. You can see here a smiling volunteer excavating one, and other perspectives. Another thing that we can see here in this destruction are evidence of both the cult but also the people who lived at the site. And in the excavation of one of the houses, we found remains of 4 or 5 skeletons of people who had been killed in the destruction. And very interestingly, these people were not buried in the destruction on the day of the conquest of the city. It turns out that these people were laying in the open air for years and possibly decades, enough time for the flesh to decompose and the bones to start to go through processes which can only happen when they're open to the air. And it seems that we have nice evidence with this and with other things of a very interesting phase of abandonment of the site, that the entire site was abandoned for perhaps decades after the destruction of the site, the conquest and the destruction of site by Hazael. At the same time, we have various evidence of cult, both in objects, but here and there in loci which seem to be specifically oriented to cult. And this very interesting building, which has at its corner plastered niches and what seems to be a square or rectangular offering table. And on this offering table, we found a group of cultic objects which, when excavated, turned out to include a very interesting combination of a pomegranate, a ring kernos, several of these, what I believe are phallic-shaped objects, and a couple of other things. And these objects were probably hanging from sort of mobile above this rectangular piece. Now, very interestingly, this room was the only room in this entire area of the excavation which was found empty. There weren't finds in it. Now, I hesitate to call this a temple because we don't have enough evidence, but I would say to give it a 100% sure identification, but there are very interesting aspects of this thing. Now, and of course, some of you may be familiar with my crazy idea about these things, and if you want to read about it, look at the article. Another interesting thing in this excavation of this level is the discovery of a bone tool workshop, something which, even though very mundane, turns out to be something that was hardly known in any other excavation in the ancient Near East. Now, when we first started doing our survey of the site, and as I said, we noticed that the 9th century pottery was predominant throughout the entire site, and it extended over an area of close to 500 dunam. And when we first published this suggestion that the site in the late 9th century was close to 500 dunam, some of the reactions of my dear colleagues was rather skeptical. And nothing like a challenge. So to prove that we can actually see remains of the size of the city, we opened up an excavation in the area of the lower city. This is the area of the upper city, which up until our excavations and survey was thought to be the extent of this site. And what we did is we simply extended it to the north of the city, between the Tel itself and the Elah River bed over here. And in Area D, right at the beginning of excavation, we can see here the relationship to the upper city, to the Elah River bed. We have a fortification line which is on surface, and then right below surface, we can see impressive remains of architecture. And again, right below surface, we come to this same destruction layer, again with the scores and scores of vessels in situ, again representing this late 9th century destruction level. Now, who caused the destruction? And I've already given you the hint. Based on our ceramic dating of this phase, we can say it's somewhere in the second half of the 9th century. The carbon-14 dating, which now we have several dates from several different laboratories, now seems to point to the second half, but an early part of the second half of the 9th century BCE. It can be matched up with destructions at other sites which seem to be contemporary, such as at Tel Zayit. As we will pull this together, I think it can be connected with the various historical evidence that we have of the central role of Hazael and the Assyrian withdrawal from southern Syria in the second half of the 9th century. And of course, basically all we know about the campaign of Hazael to the south, to Philistia, is from the biblical text. Now in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Hebrew, we have half of a passage which before the passage goes on to discuss Hazael's campaign to Jerusalem. It's mentioned very briefly that he fought against Gath and took it. For many years there was a discussion which Gath this was. I think now with the very, very convincing evidence we can say now that this is the Gath that was captured. An interesting sidebar is in the one of the versions of the Targum Shivim, of the Septuagint, there's a mention of a slightly different version, that there was a campaign to Philistia, and Hazael took the area up to Afek. And it's not clear what that source helps us, or what's its reliability. But the bottom line is all of this evidence points to identification of this destruction to Hazael, king of Aram Damascus. Now we have some very interesting additional evidence of the site. Based on the aerial photograph of the site, at the very, very beginning of the project, we noticed this very interesting feature, which I marked off here in yellow lines, which surrounds the site on the eastern, southern, and western side. And here you can see it marked off in the plan as well. And it was clear immediately that this was a siege system. And for the last 10 or so years, we've been excavating and surveying this, and now we have a clear picture of what we have here. This is a trench, and here you can see the trench, part of it excavated, and the material that was poured out of the trench, always on the side away from the city. And if you look inside the trench, you can see it's dug out in bedrock, or rather quarried out in bedrock, about 8 meters wide on the top, about 4 at the bottom, about 4 or 5 at least deep. And you can see here that it's refilled. First, there's a post-siege Iron Age II refill, and then a Byzantine period refill. But very interestingly, at the bottom of the refill material, apparently material that rolled down from the top from when the trench was still open, and there was a berm here. All the material that eventually rolled back in. We have several basically restorable vessels which seem to have been articulated before they fell out, and some of them have some, I would say, intriguing parallels with material coming from northern Syria, from the Aramean, or I wouldn't say northern Syria, Syria and the north. And this, though, requires further research. If already we're mentioning the possibility of Aramean evidence here, if we do have a siege, the question, of course, is can we point out to Aramean evidence on site? And I must say, first of all, so far not so much. The only possible parallel is a few broken stone objects which were found in Bliss and McAllister's excavation, unfortunately in a very, very unclear context. And for many, many years, they were discussed in the literature as possible Assyrian reliefs. Recently, I re-examined them after spending quite a long time looking for them in the Rockefeller Museum, and I think it can be securely said, and I thank Talai for her help on this, that this seems more like something of an Aramean or Neo-Hittite type of iconography. And it was just published in the New Eretz-Israel. Now, here's a reconstruction of what this trench looks like. And here you can see the trench, the berm, what we assume is where the fortification, and of course the city coming over here. And again, this would give you a representation of the extent of the city, of the siege trench and the berm, the siege towers that have been found around it. And it would seem that this is a full-fledged siege system, which again, if we want a comparison, at least from a functional point of view, the best comparison that is well known would be the circumvallation at Masada. Now, the idea being here is to close the people in, not let them escape, not let them get supplies, but also to make it difficult for them to attack the besiegers, because the besiegers in a siege would be situated in open ground and very, very easy to attack. And this is a method of siege which is very uncommon, particularly in antiquity, before the invention of gunpowder, and we only have a few examples of this. Now, the dating of this siege system, which we can date very, very securely to the 9th century as well, puts it as the earliest known siege system that we have in the world. That's from an archaeological point of view. Although there are mentions of sieges in historical documents from before, the actual evidence of a siege, this is the earliest evidence that we have. And it's about 2 kilometers long, about 5 meters deep, 8 meters wide, roughly about 60,000 cubic meters of earth or stone which were quarried out, which again, a very rough estimate would take about 5,000 people, about 3 to 4 months. Add to that the people defending them, the people supplying them, the people fixing their tools, etc., etc. This is a large group, and I think only a very major force and a very substantial polity could have the logistic capabilities for such an action. And with all due respect to the Israelite kingdom, the Judean kingdom, the other Philistine cities, the Ammonites, whoever, this is not them. I think the only 2 possible candidates are, one, the Assyrians, and there were no Assyrian finds, and there's no evidence of the Assyrian activity in this area in the late 9th century, in the second half of the 9th century, and I think this leaves really only the Arameans as we will go on. And here's a just finished, slightly humoristic, artistic reconstruction of what the siege might have looked like. Again, this is viewed from the side of the besiegers with the Gath, the fortified city, up over here. And here you can see the berm, the trench, one of the towers, and a couple of overweight Aramean soldiers. Now, if we have the eastern, southern, and western side, what about the north? Clearly, it wouldn't be worth anything without the north enclosed as well. And we assume that what the Arameans did is that they simply tied up to the existing trench, the natural river bed that runs along the north. And you can see it here. We have this side. The question is, what about the north? And of course, in an area that was checked using ground-penetrating radar, we managed to discover the continuation of the trench beyond the area that was seen from the air, and we could show quite clearly that we have a continuation along the east to the northern side, and we can, I would say, confidently say that we have this full enclosure around the site. Now, perhaps the smoking gun, if we use a modern term, that helps us put this in Aramean context is from the Zakur inscription. In the well-known Zakur inscription found in the early 20th century in northern Syria, Zakur, the king of Hamat and Lash, among other things, tells us how Baal Shamin, the Aramean god, saved him from the siege that Bir-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the same Hazael that we're mentioning, conducted against the city of Hadrach somewhere in the very, very early 8th century. And in line 10, he tells us that they raised the wall higher than the wall of Chazrach. They dug a ditch deeper than its ditch. And as I've discussed in an article in the Stegerfestrif, I think that this can be confidently identified as a similar method of siege as we have on the ground at es-safi and here in this inscription, and suggestions to see the charitz as some sort of tunneling, as Professor Ifal suggested, I don't think withstand scrutiny. So here we have the Aramean method of siege, if you want, mentioned in the early 8th in the Zakur inscription, and on the ground a couple of decades earlier at Tel es-safi, Gath. Now, after the destruction of Stratum A3, late 9th century, Tel es-safi goes through a big change. Gath of the Philistines is no longer an important site. It's not mentioned as a major Philistine site from this point onwards. And in fact, after a period of abandonment, and then perhaps evidence, which we're still checking, of an earthquake, there's a resettlement in the late 8th century, and the site changes. And if in the previous strata the site is of a Philistine coastal cultural orientation, from this point onwards it moves to a Judean orientation. And then 2 brief strata representing the late 8th century, we have various evidence of Judean culture, whether it's architecture, and we suggest that perhaps these 2 phases are the westward expansion of the Judean kingdom in the late 8th century, in the reign of Hezekiah, and perhaps the 2 destructions are one by Sargon and one by Sennacherib. And here you can see various examples of the distinctly Judean finds that you have on site after this destruction. And afterwards, the site is abandoned until the Persian period. Now, how can all this evidence be related to the reign of Hazael? Now, we don't know too much about Aram Damascus. I can show you some nice aerial photos of what probably was the location of the palace of Hazael. But really, Hazael is not known from the archaeological evidence in Syria, but rather he's well known from the Assyrian sources, from Aramaic inscriptions, from the extensive biblical descriptions of historical events relating to Hazael. And it's clear that in the second half of the 9th century, after he came to power, and in light of a long period of Assyrian, if you want to call it withdrawal from this region, he was the main player. He was the neighborhood bully. And he figured very, very centrally in the Levantine geopolitics. And we know very well of his campaigns, particularly from the biblical texts in the Kingdom of Israel and Transjordan. But there's a lot of other evidence that seem to indicate that he was active in other places. And here we have the ivory inlays mentioning his name, and the horse cheek guard from Samos, all indicating a very, very dominant personality. And of course, we have the Royal Aramaic inscription from Tel Dan, which most people, there are a couple of exceptions, attribute this to Hazael. And of course, the discussion of how does he relate to the rise of power of Yehu, etc. And I just want to suggest a little thing, which you'll excuse me if I'm being a little bold. How about that? Who knows? Now, you'll say I'm crazy, but since this is such a major event, and as I'll speak about this in a moment, had enormous political consequences throughout the southern Levant, it might very well be that this is mentioned in this stela as well. Now we want to try to put this within a chronological context. We know very well that Shalmaneser III, in addition to receiving tribute from Yehu, as we see in the Black Obelisk, the same year as Hazael came to power, he campaigned to Damascus. A few years later, that's his campaign to Damascus. A few years later, we know that he again campaigned to Damascus, but we know that the last campaigns of Hazael, of Shalmaneser III to southern Syria were 2 campaigns in 838 and 837. After that, all known activity are in the north. And thus, if we want to start attempting to place where the campaign in Philistia could be, I think we have several options. Notice that it has to be somewhere between, and I'm using here Rainey and Notley's chronology. Of course, you can take another one and move things a little forward or backwards. It doesn't really matter by just a few years. But it has to be somewhere from 841, where he came to power, to somewhere in the very late 9th or early 8th. And it's usually assumed that it has to be after the campaigns to Damascus. Now, for many years, the accepted... Oh, no, I don't want that one. The accepted interpretation was placing it somewhere about between 820 and 810, and the argument was that it could only occur, the campaign to Philistia, after the end of Shalmaneser III's reign, in the reign of Shamshi-Adad V, since the Assyrians were much weaker then. Another suggestion that has been recently put forward by Rainey has been to place it in the very beginning of the 8th century, and right before Adad-Nirari III's campaign to Damascus in 796. Now, I would like to argue that perhaps we're looking too late, and I think perhaps we should place it over here. And why do I argue this? For several reasons. First of all, the carbon-14 dating that we have, and now we have several good dates from this stratum, indicate that we're not dealing with the end of the 9th or the early 8th, but we're well in the middle or towards the middle of the 9th century. And clearly, it couldn't be when the Assyrians were still active in the Damascus area, so there's no reason to not to say that it couldn't be after, just a little time after the the last campaign of Shalmaneser III to Damascus. An additional point, which I think nobody's noticed, and I think is perhaps an important point, is perhaps it was also carried out right after the rise of Joash. And it could very well be that Joash, as a child king, was seen as a possible weak link in the chain, and perhaps Hazael thought this was an opportunity to campaign to Judah. Now, to reiterate the main points. Gath of the Philistines was destroyed by Hazael in the second half of the 9th century as part of a campaign to the southern coastal plain in Judah. Other sites, such as Tel Zayit and others, were also destroyed at this time. The campaign may be an attempt by Hazael to control the route to Egypt and routes from Arabia to the Mediterranean, just as his campaigns to other parts of the southern Levite were aimed at controlling strategic points and routes, such as campaigns in Transjordan. The unique siege system, earliest known in the world, can be paralleled with a description of the Aramean siege in Zakur inscription. This event was a major geopolitical event, political watershed for the land of Israel at the time, perhaps inter alia, enabling the expansion of the Judahite kingdom in the late 9th century. Following the destruction, Gath of the Philistine loses its role as a dominant polity in Philistia, and when settled again briefly in the late 8th century is under Judean control. As opposed to previous suggested dates for this campaign, an early date, around 835 and later, right after the last campaigns of Shalmaneser III to Damascus, is suggested, perhaps in an attempt to utilize the perceived weakness of Judah due to the reign of a child in Jerusalem. This early date is supported by the carbon-14 dates. As I said, perhaps this major event is even mentioned in the Dan Stela. I'm finishing. And all that's left is to hope, inshallah, that we'll find the inscription from Tel es-safi. And finally, you're all invited to join us, and we have a major project looking for people to join in various aspects in our excavation. And thank you very much.